Hi there. Welcome to English 116. Sorry for the delay in the video. I've been feeling a bit under the weather, but I believe I'm better now. And we are talking about poetry. So, as you know, the final exam will be devoted mostly to poetry, 80 points. So, the best way to prepare for the poetry section is to have read all the poetry, watched all the videos, seen all of the discussion forum questions. And there will be essay questions from which you can choose, and it's open book, open notes. So you're just basically synthesizing what we've talked about in relation to poetry. And the questions would be less factually based and more about reasoning and interpretation. And that leaves 10 points for a short story, and that would leave, or fiction, I should say, and 10 points for drama. And of course, since this is a film class, you will also have the option of writing about film as well as text. So, again, the best way to have prepared is just to have read everything, to have watched everything. You might want to review our class notes. As you know, I retire them in our past class sessions. So, you could do that. And in terms of when our final exam is going to be, it will be in approximately 2 weeks. So that will be the 14th of May, Thursday, which is the very last day, by the way, that you could hand in paper number 2, which is very similar to paper 1, the distinction being that you are writing about drama, whether you're writing about performance or you happen to be writing about text. And again, I've given you questions that are the same about talking about either canon or contemporary relevance, but you can create your own essay topic as long as you get that topic approved by me. But it's the same length and the same expectations, and reading the comments from the first paper should help you with constructing the second paper. And as we are talking about what poetry is, obviously there isn't time for a paper on poetry, which is why the bulk of the final exam is based on poetry. There's no necessarily clear definition about poetry. It'll often utilize things like rhyme, where the endings of the words sound the same, or meter, where you've got a beat, or alliteration, where the beginnings of the words sound the same. Expect it to be quite dense and compact. Yes, we can have long poems, such as the epic poems of Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, by Homer, that are as long as books. But more often than not, you've got a poem of several lines long that could be analyzed in a paper that's several pages long. So basically, everything is important. And we call this review of a close reading of a text explication, which sounds like explanation, where you go through it line by line, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, and basically you look at anything and everything that seems to have some significance. So, the fact that poetry, I think, lends itself particularly well to examining emotional states might be one of the reasons why poetry can be challenging, because it's difficult to articulate an emotional state. And poetry tries to find language for that, and I think is probably more successful than many of the other genres. But do read your poems out loud, do listen for the musicality. I've oftentimes likened poetry to music. We even use some of the same terms, verse, for instance. And just like any kind of music, some will be good and some will be bad. It's the same with poetry. Some will be good, some will be bad. But we will be focusing on those poems that have a certain level of depth and complexity to it. And one of the recommendations I have is that you explicate and also paraphrase. In other words, you put in your own words what you think is happening within the poem. There's a poem called Catch in our textbook, and if you can see in the notes below, there is a link for that, where basically it likens the idea of poetry to playing a game of catch. So it's an extended metaphor where you're comparing two very different things and showing the similarities that exist between them. And I think this poem does a very nice job of illustrating some of the challenges associated with the game of catch that could be also associated with reading or writing poetry. and written in 1950. And again, we want to know the time. We want to know the author, Robert Francis. And of course, the title will give us a lot of information. And the poem reads, Two boys, uncoached, are tossing a poem together. I think that's important too, because not only do two individuals engage in a game of catch, but there also is the writer and the reader who are involved in a kind of game, if you will, with poetry writing. And boys, the idea of childhood, that you don't necessarily need to be an adult, you don't need to have training, anybody can participate. And the idea that we're given the male gender, considering 1950, the focus on the canon being made up of males at that time period, as well as the idea of even professional sports still being made up of males, I think works quite nicely. And they're tossing this poem together, overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Note the repetition of hand, which gives it a very musical quality, but also we use our hands for not only playing catch, but for writing poetry and ideally for reading poetry if we're annotating the way we should be if we're reading carefully. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. That's what poetry really does, is that it teases us. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. In other words, we have to have a workout. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. And the idea behind a game catch is that there's supposed to be some challenge to it. I think you'll find that with poetry as well. Perhaps that's the definition of poetry, trying to fool us. Anything, everything risky, tricky, nonchalant, anything under the sun to outwit the poesy. And maybe that's what poetry is it's trying to outwit. Over the tree and the long sweet cadence down, cadence being a musicality to it. And as I had indicated, poetry is indeed an oral form. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. Maybe that's what we'll be doing with poetry, scrambling. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Notice the alliteration of P, pretty, plump, posy, and that's also for poetry, even though it's not mentioned there. So, and they even give you an example of how one could write a paper about this particular poem. Not that I'm expecting something that detailed or developed for your final exam. I understand you have only a couple of hours. Basically, what I'm going to be doing is posting your final, and you would have 24 hours in which to respond to it. If we were meeting in a face-to-face situation, you would have 2 hours to respond to it. So that's how much time I would expect you to devote to that final exam, 2 hours, even though you have 24 hours to respond to that final. And obviously, you would give a more detailed response to the poetry section than you would to the short story or you would to the drama. And of course, film is just as much of a possibility to write about as the actual text. You just don't know the questions, so it's best to be prepared to respond to any of the elements or the readings or the films that we've talked about in class. So that was just an example of how one could go about thinking about reading poetry. There were two poems that the text gave, and I believe that one of them isn't necessarily included in the more recent edition of the text, but it is included in the older editions. It's called Magic of Love, and it's very formulaic. It is very superficial. It's written to a general audience. It appeared on a greeting card, actually. And even though it rhymes, and even though it's got a beat to it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's got any kind of sophistication to it. And that's in contrast to a poem called Love Poem, which is included in the text, and I've also included a link to that. Whenever I can find links for the poems, I will include those. This is a very different kind of poem, even though the subject matter, love, is very similar. Because right from the very beginning, it leads to questions. Because obviously, something on a greeting card isn't meant to challenge or to lead to questions or debate. It's supposed to appeal to the widest audience possible. As opposed to this poem, it's a love poem written by John Frederick Nims, 1947. We assume it's a love poem because the title is Love Poem. And you can see that it's divided up into what almost looks like paragraphs. Those are known as stanzas in poetry, where you are dividing up sections and making divisions based on the introduction of new topics. And if we were to go through these stanzas, what we will find in this particular poem is that it oftentimes talks about the negative qualities of the subject of this poem, which is not necessarily what you would expect in a love poem. But it also talks about the positive. It's a much more realistic poem. And the idea of the contrast between being physically clumsy, this is one of the negative qualities of the subject of the poem, as opposed to being socially graceful, which is also one of the qualities of the subject of this poem. So it begins by saying, my clumsiest dear. And dear is a term of endearment. So it's a term of affection, but clumsy isn't necessarily what you think of in terms of complimenting someone. And how clumsy this person is, we find out whose hands shipwreck vases, not just break vases, but shipwreck is catastrophe. At whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen, have no cunning with any soft thing. So if you've ever heard of a bull in a china shop, that's what the reference is to bulls in china. Burrs in linen, linen being a very soft fabric, and burrs basically being plants with little spikes on them that would basically ruin a piece of linen. And then our second stanza talks about the positives of this person. Accept all ill at ease fidgeting people. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. And notice that lines end, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the ending of a sentence. A poet can decide to end the line at one point and have the sentence continue. So those are two separate things, the ending of a sentence and where a particular line might end in a poem, because we've got the staggered line in a poem, basically. So we're not going from one end of the page or the screen to the other. We're not going from one margin to another the way we do when we're writing sentences. And this person has so much grace with ill at ease fidgeting people, people who are shy, socially awkward, people who could be likened to refugees. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Refugee is somebody who has no place, no home. Deftly you steady the drunk clamoring on his undulate floor. So if you've ever been in a social situation where someone has had too much to drink, you know it could be quite awkward. But the subject of this poem is able to deal with that in a very graceful way. And then our third stanza gets back to some of the negative qualities. Not only is this person clumsy, but they're also a poor driver. Unpredictable dear, the taxi driver's terror. And at the time, 1947, the stereotype of a taxi driver would be a very poor driver. So this person would have to be a bad driver indeed for taxi drivers to be afraid. Shrinking from far headlights, pale as a dime. This is somebody who is afraid to make, let's say, a left turn, even though there's plenty of room. They shrink from far headlights, pale as a dime. But this same person will also leap before red apoplectic streetcars. In other words, they drive in a very unsafe manner and in a very dangerous manner. Misfit in any space and never on time. So this person is also either too late or too early. In fact, they're likened to being a wrench in the clocks in the solar system. So now we have a stanza that is not necessarily beginning with the positive, when we were alternating between negative and positive before. And this stanza combines both the negative, this person being a wrench in clocks and solar system, but also positive. Only with words and people and love you move at ease. In traffic of wit expertly maneuver and keep us all devotion at your knees. So this idea that the people who love the subject of this poem, they're actually kneeling in front of the subject. They're so devoted. And I love this idea of traffic of wit, because we were just talking about driving, and driving has a lot of similarities with talking and relationships. It can be stop and go. Some are more skilled at it than others. There could be traffic. There could be an accident. Um, and then the next stanza, forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel and your lipstick grinning on our coat. This is somebody who always spills food, leaves behind makeup stains, and the assumption is that a poem written in 1947 with a reference to lipstick, probably the subject of this poem is female. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, the idea that love can't be broken, objects can. Our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. In other words, that it's musical, it's heartwarming, it's reassuring when something breaks because that means that the subject of this poem is nearby. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study rye music for your sake. That again, the breaking of glass is musical to the individuals who love the subject of this poem because that means that this person is nearby. Because in the last two lines are, for should your hands drop white and empty, in other words, if this person were to die, all the toys of the world would break. One of my favorite lines, toys associated with youth and happiness and play and joy. And imagine if all of that were to disappear, which is what would happen if this person were no longer there. Definitely, if nothing else, this poem has a lot more complexity and really requires rereadings. And I've been suggesting 3 all semester long, but especially with poetry, you've got to have 3 readings, hopefully a lot more. The first reading just to get a sense of what's happening in the poem, and don't try to understand everything at once. Just listen to the sounds of the poem. Then the second reading, you can begin to try to decipher why those things are happening in the poem. When the first reading was what's happening in the poem. And then the last reading just to refresh yourself before you're going to discuss the poem or write about it or review it. There are ways to do something called scanning a poem. When you scan a poem, it's much like diagramming a sentence. If any of you have ever done that, if you're diagramming a sentence, you're identifying all the parts of speech in the sentence, nouns, verbs, prepositions, things of that nature. If you're scanning a poem, what you're doing is you are identifying any of the elements that might exist in the poem, specifically rhyme. There could be a rhyme scheme or a rhyme pattern. Or also, there could be meter, which is a kind of beat, which would be easier to hear, let's say, in a song because you've got someone singing and, of course, you've got musical instruments. But if you were to strip all of that away and you would just have language, then you might be able to determine a beat. What you do is you divide up the poem based on its syllables and the sounds of the syllables, the breaks. And also you identify accent marks, places that you stress in a word. So if you're familiar with other languages, Spanish and French, for instance, Romance languages, include accent marks in a way that English doesn't, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't put stress on a particular word. So something like Berniston or Bernardston, we may not necessarily have an accent mark there, but there is a way to pronounce that correctly or incorrectly. And certainly, if there were an accent mark included, it would certainly help individuals like myself who are not local or native to the area to know how to stress the particular elements in that particular word. But there are 2 poems that they use to illustrate how to scan a poem. One is called Upon Julia's Clothes, and it's a great poem because it seems simple, but oftentimes the more simple poems are really much more complex. And if you remember, we talked a little bit about rhyme and how to determine a pattern of rhyme. We use letters of the alphabet to determine a new rhyme, and we look at the last word of each line and see whether or not those rhyme or don't rhyme with each other. If there isn't a rhyme, we go to the next letter of the alphabet. So something like A Sorrowful Woman, at the very beginning of the semester, she was thinking about writing a sonnet, and perhaps she could write ABBA. What that reference was to the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern. And in this particular poem, Upon Julia's Close, and in the newest version of the text, that's on 682. So just give me a moment to get to that. What you will see is that we've got two stanzas, two breaks, for a very short poem that was written in 1648, quite a long time ago, by Robert Herrick. And the poem reads, "When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes." That's the first stanza. Second stanza being, "Next when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me." And if we were to look at the last words of each line, goes in line 1 rhymes with flows, which is line 2, which rhymes with close, which is line 3. So all of those would be identified with an A. So you've got A, A, A. And then in the second stanza, we've got a line that ends with the word C. That doesn't rhyme with goes, flows, or close. So we go to the next letter of the alphabet. That would be a B. And that is repeated in the line following with the word free, and then the last line with the word me. So basically we have a rhyme scheme or pattern of A, B, B, B. And the reality is here that I think it works very nicely for the subject matter, and it's not worth talking about the construction of a poem unless you can relate it to the meaning of the poem itself. Just like if you were scanning a sentence, it's not worth talking about nouns and verbs and adjectives if you can't make a broader statement about that. But basically, in this poem, Upon Julia's Clothes, someone is admiring someone named Julia who's wearing silk clothing. Silk is very, it's very flowing, it drapes well. They even use the term liquefaction for it. And that's the first part of the sonnet. Silk is oftentimes an expensive fabric, oftentimes associated with evening wear. The second stanza, where it says, "I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free. Oh, how that glittering taketh me." The assumption is that Julia has removed that silk clothing. So he's looking at Julia. I assume it's a he, based on the poet Robert Herrick. Julia unclothed. And it would make sense that we would have this rhyme scheme of A, B, 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 because these are two different states. State A is Julia who's clothed, who's attracted the attention of her admirer. State B is Julia unclothed, who continues to attract the attention of her admirer. So it would seem to make sense, that particular rhyme scheme. Again, it's not worth talking about the construction of a poem, such as the rhyme scheme or the meter, unless you can connect it somehow or another to the analysis of the poem. Waiting for the Storm was another poem that we were given to illustrate how you could scan a poem. In this particular instance, how would you scan a poem for meter, for the beat? And as I indicated, what you would do is basically go through the poem, divide it up into syllables. So that's on page 668. You can see that you use slash marks to divide up the syllables, and accent marks, of course, to illustrate what parts of the words you're supposed to emphasize. And this poem, we can tell from the title, it's about somebody waiting for a storm. It was written in 1986 by Timothy Steele. And it reads, "Breeze sends a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head." But if we were to go through and scan it for the meter, it would sound something like this. "Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head." So if we think of the action of the poem, it's basically somebody who's waiting for a storm. We see a transition in the weather, that there's a wrinkling darkness that's approaching. across the bay. So this person is by a body of water. They're kneeling beneath an upturned boat. So they're taking shelter underneath a boat. And the moments are changing, so it's becoming colder. The sand at my feet grows colder. The air is becoming chill and spreading. And now the rain has come, and the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. If you notice the beat, it started more slowly, it moved more quickly towards the end, and it could be said to mimic the sound of raindrops on the hull over the person's head. So the idea that the meter of this poem, present a wrinkling darkness across the bay, I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. Well, basically, that could be the sound of rain. And so it would make perfect sense that the author would choose that particular sound, that particular beat. Again, if you can't make a connection, it's not worth talking about. Some of the poems that I've assigned are not included in the textbook. They're listed as handout poems, and I've included those links for the handout poems, though luckily I've also been able to find the poems online as well, and whenever I can do that, I will provide you with a link. And again, I've emphasized the idea of reading poetry out loud because now we're ready to start talking about poetry. And I needed to start somewhere, so I decided to start with Shakespeare. Not that that is the only place to begin with poetry. Obviously, there was poetry before that, but it made sense, especially in a literature class when we're focusing on British and American literature. And Shakespeare wrote sonnets. There are lots of different kinds of sonnets, but when we reference a sonnet, we're talking about usually a Shakespearean sonnet. And sonnets have very strict rules, which is something that we talked a little bit about when we were talking about a sorrowful woman contemplating writing a sonnet. That a sonnet has to be 14 lines long. The sonnet has to have a particular rhyme scheme, which is A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, G G. It needs to be an iambic pentameter. In other words, a 10-syllable line. And it has to talk about important themes. These sonnets, Shakespeare wrote over 100 of them, so keeping to the formula, which we've oftentimes critiqued as a negative, because that could be very formulaic, but just because Shakespeare followed a formula, that doesn't mean his sonnets are formulaic. And we think that most of these sonnets were written during times of plague, when the theater houses were shut down. And that said, scholars have divided up the sonnets into two major groups, the earlier set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets. The earlier being written to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, likely Shakespeare's patron, and that would be someone who would provide financial support, political support, and the later set of sonnets thought to have been written to someone known as a dark lady, someone with dark hair and eyes, think Hermia, if you will, in Midsummer, not necessarily dark skin. And none of the sonnets were titled, so you reference the sonnets by the first line or by the number in which they're put into. And probably the most famous sonnet is Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And I have actually Sir Patrick Stewart, you might know the actor of Star Trek fame, Star Trek The Next Generation, reading this sonnet during actually the times of COVID when we were on lockdown. He decided to read a sonnet a day, thinking that the lockdown would end before he ran out of sonnets. Of course, it was the exact opposite. But we've got such a gift that this Shakespearean trained actor recorded all of this, all low tech. This wasn't in a studio. This was in his living room with his wife recording on a cell phone. But we have him reading the sonnets so that we can hear what they sound like. I wanted you to listen to Sir Patrick Stewart read that particular sonnet. He can do a much better job than I can. And he also gives a little bit of commentary about this sonnet, which is written to a young man, because this sonnet is probably the most misunderstood sonnet on the face of the planet, because people usually think that it is a romantic, even sexual poem about comparing someone's beauty to a summer's day, but this person's beauty is far superior. And the ending of the poem is that this person will live on in eternity, because as long this lives this gives life to thee. In other words, as long as the poem lives, then this person will have everlasting life, which is a pretty radical statement. Basically, Shakespeare is saying that poetry has the power to immortalize, and more specifically, Shakespeare himself has the power to immortalize. Of course, at the time, it would have been thought only God could do such a thing. So Shakespeare is really likening himself to a god. So, not unusual that Shakespeare would do something bold in his writing. And of course, the associations with summer days about perfection are negated within that particular poem, with talking about the idea of some of the negatives associated with summer. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, for instance, which is the sun. And of course, you might wonder, why didn't he just say the sun? But we've got to keep to the rhyme, we've got to keep to the meter, we've got to keep to the length. And this idea that death shall not wander us, or you shall not wander us in death's shade, and death is presented much like the sun as a he. There's a long literary tradition of that. Um, so I leave you to listen to Sir Patrick Stewart. We can talk a little bit more about Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day next class. And also, the next poem I've given you is from William Blake, 1794. And you remember that in Dead Poets Society, Mr. Keating, who's basically fondly named after the great romantic poet John Keats, was talking about the romantics, poets who would write poetry that ultimately wasn't necessarily about relationship. It was about the celebration of nature and the natural world and its connection to um, um, human worlds. And while he didn't necessarily quote from the Sick Rose, it's very similar to the kind of poetry that Keating would have done. It's a very general poem, lots of rose imagery, and we've talked about rose imagery before when we talked about Rose for Emily, for instance. There is a dark tone, and one of the things I really appreciate about The Sick Rose is that you can read it literally. It is about a rose that's sick and an invisible worm that flies in the night. Basically, it howls in the storm, attacks this rose. This is a natural process of pests living off of vegetation. But it can also be symbolic. A rose could represent a woman. The invisible worm could represent disease. It could be phallic. Um, it could be societal corruption. So there's a lot of different ways that you could read this particular poem. So that also, as you can see, I found through the Poetry Foundation on that link. And many of the links for the poems are on the Poetry Foundation. I highly recommend it. It's a great site. And you'll often be able to listen to the poems out loud. If you see a little arrow, you can click on that and then you can hear it. But of course, I encourage you to read it out loud, and I'll be reading some of the poems out loud as well. And as the semester progresses, we'll be listening to, finally, not just professional poet readers reading their poetry out loud, but the actual poets themselves. And some are more skilled than others, which is the same with musicians. So for the attendance question, since we briefly talked about two poems, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day or The Sick Rose, I was wondering, which did you prefer and why? And of course, we'll talk about these in greater depth next class, as well as other poems. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class discussing poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.